German newspaper accuses France of the loot every year €440 billion to African countries around the franc for French colonies in Africa. African franc French colonies when the Germans get involved. A German business newspaper accuses France of plundering every year €440 billion through the African CFA. The French government collects from its former colonies each year €440 billion of taxes. France relies on revenue from Africa, not to sink into economic insignificance. France can retain its status thanks to the exploitation of former colonies. German economic news. The French government collects from its former colonies each year €440 billion of taxes. France relies on revenue, not to sink into economic insignificance, warns former President Jacques Chirac. The case illustrates, a just world is difficult, because the former colonial powers themselves have become dependent on the exploitation. In the 1950s and 60s, decided the French African colonies to become independent. Although the government of Paris accepted the formal independence declarations, but called on the country to sign a so-called Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. In this they are committed to the French colonial currency FCFA, franc for French colonies in Africa, to maintain the French school and the military system and establish French as the official language. Under this law, 14 African countries are still forced to store around 85% of its foreign currency reserves in the Bank of France in Paris. They are under the direct control of the French Treasury. The countries concerned have no access to this part of their reserves. Should not be sufficient for its other 15% of the reserves, they must borrow additional funds from the French Treasury at market price. Since 1961, Paris controlled so that the foreign currency reserves of Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. In addition, these countries must annually transfer their colonial debt for the year of construction of the infrastructure in Paris, as France Silicon Africa reported in detail. Thus, France takes about €440 billion per year. The government in Paris also has a right of first refusal on all newly discovered mineral deposits in African countries. Finally, French companies should have priority in the allocation of contracts in the former colonies. Accordingly, are located where most of the assets in the areas of procurement, finance, transport, energy, and agriculture in the hands of French companies. An example of this is the first president of Togo in West Africa, Sylvanus Olympio. He refused to sign the Pact for the Continuation of Settlements. But France insisted that the Togo compensation pays for infrastructure, which was built during the French colonial period. The total amounted to about 40% of households in 1963, and Togo, led the independent country, just quickly reaches its economic limits. In addition, the new president of Togo has decided to remove and print its own currency, the French colonial currency FCFA. 3 days after this decision, the new government was overthrown by a group of former foreign legionnaires and killed the president. The head of the legionaries, Nassing B. Iadima, was converted €550 from the local French embassy for the attack, as reported by the British Telegraph. 4 years later, Iadima was developed with support from Paris, the new president of Togo. He established a tyrannical dictatorship in the West African country and stayed until his death in 2005 to power. In the following years, the government of Paris has kept going back to the old Foreign Legion to overturn unpopular governments in the former colonies. So this was the first president of the Central African Republic, David Dacko, ousted by former members of the Foreign Legion in the year 1966. The same happened to the president of Burkina Faso, Mauritius Yamiago, and the president of Benin, Matthew Kirikau. And also the first president of the Republic of Mali, Modibo Keïta, was victim of a coup by a former legionnaires in 1968. Only a few years earlier, he had decided to eliminate the French colonial currency. In contrast, other colonial powers have not adopted such measures. Britain had already learned during American Revolution of 1763 on a lesson. This was triggered by the decision of Britain. The event culminated in the Boston Tea Party and finally in the Revolutionary War and the founding of the United States in 1776. In 1778, the British Parliament on Taxation of Colonies Act adopted. Darren UK relinquished the future on sales taxes in the colonies British America and British West Indies. This also applies to the old Australian and Canadian colonies. While these are still Commonwealth of Nations and thus formally bind the British royal family, but as Stuart since the country's declaration of independence in the early 20th century, exclusively with local governments at the latest. The former Dutch colonial power rejects more tax on its former sphere of influence in South America and Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, the finances were in the early 20th century due to devastating wars so disastrous that the Netherlands had their colonies financially support regularly. The separate kingdom of the majority of its colonies in the early 19th century. The kingdom has recently left the Netherlands Antilles in October 2010. Only the Caribbean islands of Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten are still part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The French political elite, on the other hand, do not think, in my mind, to eliminate the vestiges of the colonial era and reject the former colonies independently. Rather, it seems to Paris crane eater away and could run without revenue from Africa in the economic insignificance. Even former French President Jacques Chirac said in March 2008, without the Africa, France slipping to the level of a third world country. German new economy. Schmoz. Thank you. Subscribe and stay taped on my YouTube channel Strategy Pan.